Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's session hosted jointly by the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Migration, the RAMP Project, and the Institute for Migration. We're going to be looking this afternoon at the UK's response and involvement with the Global Compact for Migration. My name's David Simmons. I'm the Member of Parliament for Ruislip North and I, as well as being a RAMP principal, I'm the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Migration. And it's my role to introduce today's panel, who are a variety of people able to bring to bear their expert opinion in relation to the debate. Now, clearly, the UK has a bill coming forward to Parliament about a new approach to migration. And that's after a long period where issues ranging from the risks inherent in people seeking to cross the English Channel to come to the UK to register asylum claims, through to the UK's approach to global resettlement and our involvement with the United Nations have all been high on the public and the political agenda. And it seems a good moment to reflect on what is coming forward with a variety of people who can bring to bear experience and expertise from different parts of the system. So our panel today consists of Jonathan Prentice, who's the head of Secretariat for the UN Network for Migration, Paul Whittingham, who is the Deputy Director and the head of the Migration Department at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, Daniel Hobbs, Director for Asylum Protection and Enforcement at the Home Office, Sarah Elliott, who's a legal officer from the UN High Commission for Refugees, and Paul Blomfield, who's the MP for Sheffield Central. The structure of the session is going to be, firstly, we will hear from our expert panelists, and they'll give each of their perspectives. At the end of that, we'll have then an opportunity for an open question and answer session, and very much welcome from the many people who are attending today, so we've got over 80 participants signed in already, to hear from the NGOs from across the sector, really, with an interest in migration, how people respond to what our experts have to say, but also any thoughts people have as we go towards that debate around the parliamentary passage of the new model for immigration. So I hope it's going to be a useful session. We will finish promptly around 5:25 to 5:30, and I'm therefore going to move swiftly to welcome our first panelist. Particularly would ask each panelist, if you wouldn't mind just saying a little bit about who you are, giving your name, and what your role is as you begin to make your contribution. So the first, according to my list, and I'm just checking that's correct, is Jonathan Prentice. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you to all the colleagues at the All-Party Parliamentary Group and RAMP for organising, I think, this important discussion, indeed coming at an important time. I'm the head of the United Nations Secretariat for the Network on Migration, which is the attempt by the UN system to bring together the full summation of its expertise and capacities towards supporting member states of the UN system and all stakeholders in implementing the Global Compact for safe, orderly and regular migration. I don't wish either to lecture nor to assume knowledge which might not be there. So I'll begin, if I may, with just a few words about what the Global Compact for Migration, the GCM, we love acronyms in the UN, what the GCM is. Essentially, it is a major milestone in the pursuit of effective migration governance. It provides a cooperative framework by which states and all other expert actors can engage with a common lexicon in pursuit of effective migration management that places the welfare of migrants and their communities at the heart of all that we do. It is non-binding, but it is based on international law, and it does call for a fact-based discourse. It is predicated on the assumption and the belief that no one actor, no one state, no one community can achieve their migration goals alone, but rather they need to coordinate and to cooperate with others. And it is comprised of 23 objectives covering the full arc of the migration narrative, and 10 guiding principles, reaffirming our commitments to national sovereignty, to the upholding of human rights, to paying particular priority to the welfare of children, for example, and to ensuring that our approaches to migration engage a whole of society approach. I said at the outset that this is an important moment for this discussion, not simply because of the debates and discourse going on in the UK itself, but also because we are on the verge of the first international review of the impact of the GCM, which will take place in the General Assembly in New York in the first half of next year. And I think provides a pivotal opportunity, not simply to reflect on how impactful the GCM has been to date, but also to set a course for its future implementation. So that in a nutshell is the GCM. The second point I would like to raise is that the UK has been hugely engaged and committed to, firstly, arriving at the GCM. This was a process of complex negotiation and consultation on an interstate level, and the UK played an extremely constructive driving role in that. The GCM called for a fund to support the implementation of the GCM, recognizing that not all states had equal capacities, and the UK has been a primary contributor to that, both financially, but also in helping to steer the direction of the fund through membership of its governance function. And the UK was also an active player in the Europe regional review of the GCM, which took place late last year. I should say also that the network, which I'm representing today, is the UN system's commitment to the membership of the UN to provide coordinated, coherent, impactful support to them in their implementation. So in addition to advancing our collective migration agenda, the network also represents another commitment of the UK as a committed multilateralism, which is to ensure that the UN is the best that it can be for its membership, the most coherent, the most efficient. The third point I would like to make, if I may, is, and this is the third of four, in case people are wondering if this is an endless list. The third point I would like to make is that a key feature of the Global Compact for Migration is its inclusive nature. Clearly, member states and their governments are at the center of this. This is a member state driven document, but the Global Compact at every turn recognizes the pivotal role of all stakeholders, including legislatures, in driving forward the aspirations that are contained in the GCM, in shaping the debate and in providing expertise, in ensuring inclusivity, that all interests are represented, all voices are heard, and in helping to steer the tone of the discourse, which unfortunately in the field of migration is not always optimal. And I would like here, if I may, to point to the efforts of IOM, the International Organization for Migration in the UK, for its efforts in raising awareness about the GCM at the national level. And then my final point is simply to flag from a very broad canvas a number of substantive issues that I would like to draw to your attention today. Firstly, are the linkages between climate and migration. This obviously is increasingly on the international agenda. The UK, I don't need to tell you, will be hosting COP26 towards the end of this year. It is worth bearing in mind that in 2021, 31 million people were internally displaced as a result of climatic phenomena and natural disasters. And the GCM calls for combating the impacts of climate change and promoting the expansion of regular pathways for those so impacted by such change. Secondly, obviously, also at the forefront of our collective agendas, are COVID-19 pandemic response and recovery efforts, and the vital urgency of ensuring equitable access for all, including migrants, irrespective of their status, to effective vaccination and other measures. Thirdly, and I know this is of interest in the UK domain, is the issue of legal pathways. And here, I would like to flag that next week, actually on the 15th of July, the network, the United Nations network, will be launching its guidance note on regular pathways for migrants in vulnerable situations. This will be a public event. I'm happy to pass on to RAMP and the all-party parliamentary group the details of this. The guidelines have been developed in close consultation with a broad range of actors, governmental and non-governmental, and I would commend that meeting to you as a contribution to your discourse. And then finally, my final point is on our advocacy around alternatives to immigration detention. And here again, I would call your attention to the policy brief that we have developed, highlighting a number of practical recommendations, that we have developed a series of peer-to-peer exchanges, bringing together governments and experts from around the world to share best practices and truly to find ways to put to an end detention simply on the basis of migration status. I hope I didn't exceed my 7 minutes, Chair. I hand the floor back to you. Thank you.
Jonathan, that was commendably efficient and beautifully timely. Thank you very much. And also very interesting to get that perspective, because clearly the UK is part of an international system, and especially the point about detention on the basis of migration status is one which is a significant part of the debate in the UK. So our next speaker is going to be Paul Whittingham, who is the Deputy Director and Head of Migration. Paul, I'm just looking, yeah, there you are. Paul, I'm going to hand the floor to you at this point. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, David, and thank you to all of you who are online and who've joined this session. It's great to be here. One of the challenges of the experience we've all been through working remotely and with the pandemic is that we've not been able, as much as I would have liked, to network like this and to share ideas. So these sorts of events are really valuable to us. So as David said, I'm the head of the FCDO's migration department. For the merger of DFID and the FCO, I was the head of DFID's Migration and Modern Slavery department. I was, and I've been in this role in various forms for about 4 years now, and I was part of the UK negotiating team on the Global Compact, which seems a while ago now. But that's a little bit my background. I'm going to try and follow Jonathan's excellent presentation, say a little bit about what the Global Compact means to the UK's international work, and try and relate it to our international priorities. The National Plan on Immigration, I'm sure, will attract a lot of attention at the moment and in this session, and my colleague Dan will cover this shortly. So I'm going to try, as I say, to complement that with some discussion of our international context. And I want to start with the integrated review, which I'm sure you online are familiar with, this exercise that was conducted recently by the government to review our development, diplomacy, defence and security posture, and as the name suggests, look at it in an integrated way. And that approach and that review very much frames how we look at migration and through a global lens. We know on this call, because we are all stakeholders work on migration, that there are some 270 plus million international migrants globally, which accounts for about 3% of the world population. And we know that when managed well, migration is a tremendous source of opportunity for migrants and countries of origin and countries of destination. The flip side is that when it's managed poorly, when migrants are put at risk, and the development benefits are lessened. And at its worst, poorly managed migration produces the images we see from the Mediterranean and the Channel. Of course, we shouldn't forget all those who move outside of the international spotlight, migrant workers in the Gulf, for example, or East Asia. So one of the shifts that the integrated review announced was a geographical shift. And as we shift that focus, we're keen to take a broad international view. Migrants, both regular and irregular, send enormous amounts of money back to their families and their communities. And migration is a cornerstone of livelihoods around the world, and certainly dwarfing global ODA. And actually, I'm sure, like many of you, I have been watching the impact of the pandemic on migration, and in particular on the overall level of remittances. And these have been relatively robust, though of course they have been hit and fallen to just 8 billion, I think, in the last year is the latest figure we have. So clearly there's been a big hit on remittances. So what does this mean then? In the integrated review, we restate our commitment to our long and positive history of migration in this country. The integrated review says that most migrants move through safe, legal routes, and that the economic benefits of their doing so are enormous, both for host countries, including the UK, and for their countries of origin, for example, through remittances. So I quote that because I think it's really important to recognise that the integrated review, which frames the UK's posture and outlook globally, recognises the enormous value that migration has and can continue to play. Our domestic immigration policy sits within this wider perspective. And I'll briefly outline the components to this domestic, to this approach, of which there are three. The first is irregular migration, using the whole of route approach, considering the incentives for people to move, their interactions with governments, other authorities along the route, their access for information and to essential services. These are all the elements that the integrated review commits us to. And it was also the focus of our big ODA program, which many of you will be familiar with, which worked in the Sahel in particular, and those migration routes up through Libya and into the Mediterranean, which the IOM helped to implement. And we're just reviewing that program, by the way. That will go public very soon, and we'd be very happy to have a conversation like this about the successes of that. So that's our sort of approach to irregular migration. The second pillar of the international approach to migration that the UK has is regular migration. Clearly, in part, that is about attracting talent through regular pathways to the UK. In the development or ODA space, we're working on our approach to supporting productive migration in line with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Compact, maximising the benefits of safe and regular migration within the Global South. Now, we're developing a theory of change for this approach, but it is essentially that if migrants have better information to make informed choices before they migrate, if they possess the relevant skills, if employment conditions and recruitment are switched from a migrant abuse model towards one that's rooted in international standards, and if government policies are built on data and evidence to ensure proactive and labour market relevant responses, then migration and human mobility can transform from the current dangerous livelihood strategy it is for so many people to a productive force that brings benefits to migrants, their families, and their communities in the whole region. So that's really the approach that we're developing and looking to test. And we hope to apply some of our ODA to testing that in our new programming. The third element and dimension of our international approach is probably the most relevant to this conversation, and that's the international coordination that's necessary. We can't work as the UK in a vacuum, of course. We need an internationally agreed set of principles to work within, a common political voice, and a way to coordinate. And that, of course, is the role that the Global Compact fulfills. As Jonathan has said, the UK took part actively in the negotiations for it, and we remain proud signatories and active supporters of the compact. And the value that we see, I think, in the compact is largely as a forum for comparing experience of migration and to showcase the migration experience in our own country. The biennial reviews that Jonathan mentioned, they require countries, force countries, including the UK, to examine their work and to explain it and to be transparent about it to our peers. And the first review that took place, I think, at the end of last year was extremely useful to us from that perspective. The compact provides an interface with the UN system and the UN network and its working groups, and we're very grateful to Jonathan and his team for building up these tools in this space, including the new migration network hub. And the compact is an important accountability mechanism. We made public commitments that we can be reminded of and held to account for. And it is a way to pool resources. And we're pleased that we've been able to make a contribution to the trust fund that supports implementation of the Global Compact. And Jonathan has mentioned climate, and it's a very big year for us in climate. It's a key priority, as Jonathan said, for the UN network. As the president of COP, we are working to ensure that there are platforms for migration to be discussed in an open way. And as part of this, we'll be shortly publishing a rapid evidence assessment commissioned by the FCDO to contribute to the debate. And so I hope that's something that informs the discussions around climate in COP and beyond. And of course, we have the IMRF, the review in next year, which is the first senior level platform to discuss migration since the compact was signed. And so we will be active participants in that. Turning finally to the Global Compact in the UK, the Global Compact is not as well recognised in the UK as it is in other countries. In the UK, the compact is largely confined to the UK's international work. It's rarely referenced, I think, in the debate on domestic policy. And much of the UK's constituency on the Global Compact is international NGOs and research institutions. So I think there is scope to broaden the appeal. And the challenge for the FCDO is to maintain the UK profile on the international stage, but also advocating for the mechanism within government. I think there's a challenge for our parliamentary stakeholders as well to raise the compact and international issues of migration in fora such as today's. And I think there's a challenge for the UN system to present the compact not only as an aspirational document, but as a practical framework for policy development, to translate the principles of the compact, which Jonathan has outlined, for policymakers in a developed country as well as in the developing world, recognizing that the principles aren't universally shared. And I think a really important area, which the compact for the UN system, but for us as well, is to help us to bring evidence on migration. Much of the debate and the comments on migration are not well evidenced. And I think the compact provides a really important space and platform for that to happen. So, David, that is a little overview, I think, of where we and the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, how we see the compact adding value to the debate and how it plays into the domestic debate on migration here in the UK. I hope that was within the 7 minutes. Thanks very much.
We're slightly over, but useful time spent with the insights that you've given. And I know we have those on the call present from the International Organisation for Migration who'll be able to talk a bit more about that particular piece of context. Now, our next speaker is going to be Daniel Hobbs, who is the Director for Asylum, Protection and Enforcement, the APED Department at the Home Office. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. As you say, my name is Dan, and I'm the Director for Asylum, Protection and Enforcement, and I've spent the best part of at least 10 years working in a range of roles around asylum, immigration and refugee resettlement. And I've had the pleasure of meeting many of you on some occasions. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the new plan for immigration, which David, you alluded to in your opening remarks, and the bill that was put before Parliament yesterday. So just going back slightly, in March, the Home Secretary set out the policy statement on the new plan, noting that at its heart, the plan had a simple principle around fairness in terms of access to the UK asylum system being based on need and not the ability to pay people smugglers. And obviously it's clear, and we do set out in the plan, that the migration, particularly the illegal migration we see coming into the UK, is obviously part of a much wider global phenomenon, of which Paul spoke about a moment ago. So, as you will know, the UK already has an asylum system that offers protection for the most vulnerable, but currently it's facing serious pressure for what in effect is a parallel route often for illegal migrations facilitated by criminal and organised gangs which smuggle people into the UK through clandestine means, and the government is very focused on preventing the loss of life both in the Channel, in lorries, or in the Mediterranean. So the new plan for immigration the government has introduced is one of the most significant overhauls of the asylum system in decades, and it really is end-to-end reform. So when it talks about the asylum system, it is also talking about the powers for border force on securing the border, how asylum claims are dealt with in the UK, and also the systems around justice and the appeal system. And as I said earlier, the Nationality and Borders Bill was introduced into Parliament yesterday and had its first reading, which seeks to put part of the new plan into law. For those of you who are familiar with this, you'll recognise that the new plan is much wider than just the bill. It's part of an overall approach that builds on operational policy, secondary legislation, and the primary legislation. The plan is driven by three objectives around a fair but firm system. First, it's to increase the fairness of the system so we can protect those and support those in genuine need of asylum and protection in the UK. The second is to deter illegal entry into the UK and break the business model of people smugglers and seeking to protect the lives of those who such actions put in danger. And finally, it's to be able to remove more easily from the UK those who have no right to be here, including foreign national offenders. So I'll talk a little bit first about the safe and legal routes, which is not something that appears in the primary legislation because it's not an issue that requires primary legislation. As those of you will be familiar with, the UK resettlement scheme that has run on an increased basis since 2015 doesn't require primary legislation. And the core here is that the government has set out that it wants to build on its history here. So obviously, as part of our approach to legal and safe, Paul talked about some of the work the government has done in committing over £10 billion a year in ODA to support migration activities and development activities. And the UK is one of the leading refugee resettlement states in the world, fourth, I think, globally, and in the last few years has resettled more refugees directly from regions of conflict than any other European country. So we have those well-established legal and safe routes that have allowed us to support over 25,000 men, women and children since 2015. And alongside that, we have family reunion rules, which have allowed 29,000 close relatives of refugees in the UK in the last 5 years to come to the UK. Now, obviously, that's set against an 80 million estimated people displaced worldwide. You know, there's always going to be a challenge, but I think the government is clear that it wants to enhance and step up its approach to legal and safe routes, but it's not the whole answer to the challenges of those people displaced around the world. But the new plan does make clear its commitment that it wants to maintain those well-defined routes for refugees in need of protection to come to the UK safely and to be able to, as importantly, succeed and integrate here and contribute for their own well-being and also for the communities in which they are integrated into. So going back to the Global Compact, that obviously does, at its key, promote safe, orderly and regular migration and manage those risks to protect victims from unsafe and illegal migration. And I think, again, you can see the parallel there with the new plan, which is very much about strengthening that approach and being consistent with the GCM objectives. And you heard from Paul on the significant programs of protection for migrants against modern slavery and the cross-government programming that happens with FCDO and others across government as part of the wider conflict, security and stability work and the integrated review. But there's also work with Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government and local authorities up and down the country to support strong integrated communities for people to be able to live, work and socialise together with shared values and support that integration. Again, elements that are very evident in the GCM. So just going back again in terms of the new plan, I think there are a number of areas where the plan is consistent with the GCM. I mean, the objectives 5, 7, 16 and also 11 around securing the border are very clearly evident in the new plan and pathways for regular migration. You'll be aware that we have also, alongside the new plan, which is very focused on illegal migration, asylum and returns, the UK has set out the new global points-based system, having ended free movement, that opens the work routes to everybody across the globe. And equally, we have taken action both on Afghanistan to provide a route to safety for those people who've supported the UK services in Afghanistan, and also the route for British nationality holders overseas, BNO status holders in Hong Kong, following the erosion of their rights there. So again, there's a number of things that alongside the plan and the legislation that are going on to open up those pathways both for work and protection in the UK. Talking a little bit about resettlement, which I touched on earlier, the government has committed, as I said, to strengthen these routes and measures which broaden access for refugees, and in the policy statement it alluded to a number of measures that it is considering as part of that. We obviously ran a consultation, and those consultation responses have been fully considered in the development of the bill. But as I say, a number of those elements don't require primary legislation. You'll also know that we have continued, and post the height of the pandemic, we have been able to restart our global resettlement scheme and started welcoming people back into the UK. Obviously that was challenged during the pandemic and the global movement of people, but we are able to and have been able to restart our resettlement alongside the work we're doing on Afghanistan right now. And we want to continue to look at how we use community sponsorship and other schemes as part of our global resettlement scheme. So one that isn't just based on primarily on the conflict in Syria, where it has been for the last 5 years, to look at a full range of persecuted minorities and other groups, so that we're able to have a genuinely global system to provide protection. And that, as I say, is part of the government's fair but firm asylum system, where it will continue to provide protection for the most vulnerable. You'll be aware as well that there is a commitment in the Immigration Social Security Act for us to review the safe and legal routes, particularly around family reunion. We have undertaken that consultation and review as part of the wider consultation on the new plan for immigration, and the government will publish its findings and policy response to that shortly. Obviously that's a matter for ministers rather than me as an official. And we have kind of already made clear the rules and routes available to individuals who wish to bring their family and extended family under exceptional circumstances to the UK. We've also started talking with various partners, including RAMP, about the talent beyond borders, and with UNHCR about how we look at options for reducing barriers for talent that is displaced around the world, so that they are able to access the global points-based system that I spoke about earlier. Between 2010 and 2017, we were able to provide work permits to over 3,000, work and study permits actually, to over 3,000 people from countries such as Afghanistan, Eritrea, Iraq, Somalia, and Syria. But I think we want to look about further how we can build on that and make sure that displaced talent are able to access those legal and safe routes to be able to work and study in the UK. And as I say, it's something that we've been in discussion with a range of partners, including UNHCR, about taking forward. And as I said
I'm going to have to ask you to wind your contribution. That's okay.
Okay, that's fine. I'll stop there, David. I mean, I was just going to talk about the integration element and the outcome fund, which is the other important element. So this is about ensuring that when people get to the UK, we're able to invest in their integration.
Thank you. It's a fantastic contribution that you've made. I was very struck, in particular, given the debates that have been going on in Westminster and the questions about how we support and encourage people really to integrate, to hear about the work that's going on. I'm sure there will be questions for you when we come to that.
I'm sure. Thank you, David.
I'm just going to move on now to our next speaker, who's Sarah Elliott, who's a legal officer with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and I hope you can all hear me okay. I've been with the UN Refugee Agency about 10 years now, but I started off with a real focus on the intersections between displacement and trafficking and smuggling before coming to Geneva, where I was part of a small team in headquarters that was actually engaged on the design of the Global Compact for Migration before coming to London as a legal officer. So it's great to be here to talk about that document. I am going to start, however, by talking about what it isn't and the differences with the Global Compact on Refugees, which it is commonly conflated with, and that's not surprising. But then I'll come back to the domestic context and the new plan for migration. Global responsibility sharing for refugees, as opposed to migration, has benefited from 70 years of state commitment and doctrine and practice that began with the 1951 Refugee Convention, but has culminated with this new Global Compact on Refugees. And the essential idea of the compact wasn't to reshape the international legal doctrine at all, but to improve the way in which the international community was responding to large movements of refugees and also what we call protracted refugee situations, so long-standing displacement, which just simply were growing in number, and Dan alluded to that number being above 80 million now, and it wasn't getting enough predictable and equitable support from the international community. So the GCR tries to contribute to that in a number of different ways. For example, asking states to commit to greater resettlement places, but also to admit refugees through things like work visas, scholarships, and eased expanded family reunion. There is an annex to the GCR, which includes something called the CRRF, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, which is intended to ensure more predictable humanitarian funding for new and emerging refugee crises, and also comprehensive stakeholder responses. So let's bring in more actors early on to try to prevent these crises from coming long term. And then finally, it also introduces something called the Asylum Capacity Support Group, where a state can say, hey, I need help in building or improving my asylum system, and another state can come along and provide that assistance. These are all areas that the UK has historically and generously contributed to in close cooperation with us, as Dan also mentioned, and their contributions would ask the UK to continue to report on when it engages with the Global Compact on Refugees reporting mechanisms. International cooperation on migration, however, has not to date benefited from that kind of platform, practice and policy, despite the fact that how one state decides to manage its borders will inevitably impact on how another state does, on how people move and on smugglers, right? You pay very close attention. And even though the GCM, it's a broad set of objectives and principles, and I agree with Paul, they do not solve the practical tensions between migrant rights, international cooperation and state sovereignty, it does go some way to try to strike a balance between these imperatives, and I do believe it provides a broad, comprehensive framework for where we need to do better as an international community on migration. So at the request of the Secretary General, UNHCR was asked, among others, to support IOM in the development of the GCM document, and we were asked to bring our protection expertise to the table. We are invested in its success to ensure both refugees and migrants are treated humanely. We want to ensure that asylum systems are not overburdened as a catch-all for all vulnerable migrants who fall through the cracks of state systems and have no other choice to make their concerns heard and who may end up in the hands of smugglers and traffickers to result. But what we really want to see as UNHCR is a genuine good faith engagement by the United Kingdom with this compact. And what that means is not trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, so to speak, but actually requires a true rethinking of the UK's migration strategy with the GCM and the GCR as a guide. And so we're here today to focus in particular on the commitment to promote safe and regular migration pathways to the UK, which is something we welcome as UNHCR. And our position on the wider asylum aspects of the new plan for immigration can be found on our website, and I won't be talking about those specifically today. But in focusing on safe and regular routes, in its submission to the European Union round of reviews on the GCM, we picked up that the UK said explicitly in overhauling its immigration system, it would make it more fair and more compassionate. Paul Whittingham asked the UN to translate the GCM principles into practical policy, so I'm going to try and do that for you all now. And in our view, a more compassionate approach to enhance safe regular pathways to the UK, as well as to its own management of migrants in the UK proper, could look something like this. One would be to contribute more to regional relocation efforts of extremely vulnerable migrants, including unaccompanied children, but also potential persons in need of international protection. We feel that support to vulnerable migrants can't just be where they are or keeping them there. It must also engage with the reasons for why they move. And we've already discussed all of those intersecting issues, including climate. We need to remove the excessive criminalisation of irregular arrivals. Of what statistics we do have at hand as UNHCR, at least as concerns asylum, the number that the UK receives of asylum applicants is far lower than other EU countries, and it continues to drop every year. The UK has the capacity to manage these and other irregular arrivals in a humane and efficient manner, and to assess their reasons for coming. And we are working with the government very closely on front loading its screening system and on case triaging to work towards this. We think that it can improve its access to and the ease by which family members can join their relatives in the UK. The current bill actually foresees diminished refugee rights for so-called Group 2 refugees, and the original plan proposed an expanded definition of family for resettled refugees only. And we think that's a shame and a missed opportunity that will play into the hands of smugglers. We'd like to see the government scale up the use of alternatives to detention to support migrants who are refused asylum find case resolution in the community. We've been working with the government to pilot 2 of these, and an evaluation of the first will soon be published, which we're really excited about. We understand that the bill foresees a new reception centre system, and we certainly hope that these centres will be open and provide comprehensive services and support to residents to resolve their immigration status. We also want the government to ensure that those who have no right to stay, but who cannot be returned to their country of origin through no fault of their own, after a period of time, are given the right to work and study and contribute to the public purse. Leaving these people in limbo in perpetuity is extremely harmful and isn't in line with the aspirations of the GCM. We want to remove the high cost for recognised stateless migrants to apply for citizenship. We want to see a vastly improved access to quality legal aid. The MPI mentions improving legal advice at certain stages in an immigration journey, which we welcome, but we were disappointed overall that the MPI didn't look at how the lack of quality legal aid has contributed to inefficiencies and delays in the asylum and immigration system, rather than point the finger at unmeritorious claims or attempts to rig the system. And finally, the COVID-19 pandemic did really bring to light the critical role played by migrants in the health and social care systems, as well as in other essential service roles. Under the new points-based system, many of these critical roles would still not fall within the lower salary threshold or meet the minimum qualification requirements. So we still feel it's too highly predicated on high-skill workers, even though it has a much wider remit. And it is still significantly supplemented by seasonal and frontier worker permits with limited rights. So it would be good to see more low-skilled labour pathways open up where demand for these are evidenced. I think the final point to say about what a compassionate approach to migration would look like in the UK is, in order to continue, importantly, to say that it is a leader in eradicating modern slavery, the government government needs to do a comprehensive assessment of how its domestic asylum and immigration policies may push people into exploitative situations. And that can include persons who have a recognised status, but who fall off the cliff edge of state support structures once recognised. And I'll wrap it up just by saying that we absolutely recognise that designing a fair, compassionate, global-oriented migration strategy is an incredibly complex ethical and administrative challenge, and that the GCM, as Jonathan said, was envisaged as a tool to help states do that from multiple angles, bringing in a much wider array of stakeholders to the table, including the diaspora, local authorities and migrants themselves. So we as UNHCR, along with IOM, we're totally committed to working with the government to ensure that the safe, regular routes described by Dan and others are accessible and sustainable, but also importantly that its migration system is really based on evidence and not based on fear. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. That was very, very helpful. And again, one of the big challenges I think we often hear in the debate about migration is where UK policy fits with international commitments that we may be in. So, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights and the various different pieces of international either law or agreements that we have through the United Nations and multilaterally. So really, really useful insight. I'm sure there'll be some questions about that when we move on to the open session. I'd like to invite our last guest speaker, who's Paul Blomfield, MP. He's the Member of Parliament Sheffield Central, former chair of the APPG for migration. I know we're just about to go into the political debate about what the new legislation means. I'm sure, given it is extremely new and it will also go through a process of debate, we're going to hear some interesting ideas about where it might be improved, altered, in order to take things forward. So, Paul, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, David. And it's interesting to contribute to an expert panel. I have to say I don't feel an expert on the issue, but what I hope I can bring is some experience over 11 years as an MP, which has given me some understanding of the system, of the need for reform, no illusions about the challenges we face, and a recognition that probably both main parties in government haven't got this right. What I've been asked to do is to kind of reflect on the new plan for immigration and the bill that was published yesterday. I've not had an opportunity to fully digest it. But I do think that Paul was right when he says that the Global Compact doesn't have the sort of currency in our discourse that it might well have. But it has, when I've reflected on today's session, provided a useful framework against which to have a look at the government's proposals and share my my initial reaction. I think I do accept that the new plan for immigration has at its core a stated objective of increasing fairness and efficacy of the system to better protect and support those in genuine need of asylum. But I am concerned that much of the detail mitigates against that aim. I accept that there are points of convergence, but I think probably my role today is to look at the difficulties and looking at how they sit with the Global Compact. So perhaps starting with point 5 of the Compact, enhancing availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration. And it does feel as if the government's objective doesn't focus enough on enhancing pathways. And I take the point that Dan was making about the UK resettlement scheme. But I think it's perhaps disappointing that the proposals for the development of pathways are still obscure and haven't been published kind of alongside the plan itself, because it does lead many of us to fear that what's happening is closing and reducing pathways. And particularly, obviously, one of the central parts of the new plan is deeming many of the pathways that asylum seekers have used as illegal and removing all long-term rights from anybody who makes that choice, creating this division between legitimate and illegitimate asylum seekers, which I know is at the heart of many concerns. Now, on Monday this week, for example, I heard from an Afghan woman now settled with refugee status in the UK, who talked about the desperate circumstances in which she fled her country, and made it clear to me that there were only what would now be deemed to be illegal routes open to her, and she's just one example. Point 7 of the compact talks about addressing and reducing vulnerabilities in migration, but there's nothing in the new plan that reduces the vulnerability that she faced or many others face. And we know, I think from experience, that it's often many of the most vulnerable who are forced to turn to illegal routes. I think there's also concern about the discussion about offshoring centres for asylum seekers while processing claims, which will expose many, and from the refugee women I met earlier this week, particularly women, to exploitation. And arguably offshoring also contravenes points 19 and 20 of the compact on the financial contribution and inclusion of migrants. I think there are also a lot of concerns around the government's proposals in relation to point 12 of the compact on strengthening certainty and predictability in migration procedures for appropriate screening, assessment and referral. And those starts with clause 10 of the bill, which allows for differential treatment of refugees depending on mode of arrival. And clause 10.5 very specifically talks about the sort of differences in treatment, to include length of leave, requirements to meet for settlement, treatment of family members, conditions to attach to leave, and so on. And that differentiation seems to strike a discordant note with point 12. I think there are concerns too about the proposals for appeals. And I talk to many asylum seekers who absolutely share the frustration of the length of time that applications can take, and often years. But I do worry about clause 24's accelerated detained appeals and the potential risk for miscarriages of justice, particularly with the Secretary of State being given undefined powers to certify cases as suitable for accelerated appeal. The explanatory notes to the bill, which I was looking at last night, highlight the fact that 90% of judicial reviews were dismissed or refused, and make that point to challenge their validity. But it fails to acknowledge that around 40% of appeals are successful, which underlines their importance. Clauses 18 to 21 of the bill introduce what is described as priority removal notices, which can be imposed on any person liable to removal or deportation, which will cause the appeal to be heard directly in an upper tribunal, and requires them to be determined, quote, more quickly than any appeal under section 82(1) would in the normal course of events be determined by a first tier tribunal. So it does suggest a partial return of single tier appeals. And I think this uncertainty does call into question point 12 of the compact's emphasis on predictability and due process. I think there are also serious worries about what might be described as the front loading of the value given to evidence in the asylum seeker's journey and the appeals process, with clause 24 of the bill saying judges will be told to give minimal weight to evidence raised later in the process unless there are exceptional circumstances, and there are several provisions which penalise the submission of late evidence. Now, I understand the thinking behind that, but I think the proposal ignores the reality of how asylum claims are made and how people seeking asylum are able to gather and submit evidence. And we all know of many asylum seekers who've been traumatized by the experiences of brought them to our shores and find it difficult to talk about all of their experiences in initial interview. And I've met women who took considerable time to talk about their experiences of trafficking or sexual abuse, which their culture made it particularly difficult to share, and at the first opportunity to have that conversation. So I think there are a whole series of issues there. Point 13 of the compact, and it reflects on one of Sarah's points, is to use migration detention only as a measure of last resort and to work towards alternatives. I fear that, and would be happy to be reassured, and I've raised this issue with ministers, that the government appears to be moving in the opposite direction. I was vice chair of the all-party migration and refugee groups inquiry into immigration detention in 2014. Our proposals to move away from detention towards community-based alternatives driven by a 28-day statutory limit were endorsed by the House of Commons, and the government were moving in that direction. I think there was, from my meetings with both Home Office officials and ministers, a real commitment to the Home Office pilots. I worry that we might be moving in a different direction. I'm grateful to Sarah's reassurance that the Action Access pilot's assessment will be published soon, but obviously over this last period we've seen the use of Napier and Penley barracks, which raised serious concerns to the Prisons and Borders Inspectorate. We're going further with a proposed new immigration detention centre for women in County Durham, the first since 2014. Clause 11 of the bill allows for differential provision of accommodation to asylum seekers depending on compliance with various conditions, which suggests the possible use of asylum centres like the barracks as a form of punishment for those who travel via irregular routes or don't comply with conditions, which I think also breaks potentially point, and certainly the experience at Napier and Penley, break points 17 of the compact as well as 15 and 19 on access to services and integration. I'll stop there other than to say that I do worry that overall there's much that conflicts with the responsibility in points, well, much within the surrounding political discourse on the bill and the new plan, which is in conflict with points 17 of the compact, which is to quote, to promote evidence-based public discourse to shape perceptions of migration. So I hope that's a helpful reflection, David.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's an enormously helpful reflection. I think in many ways the point that you finished on is a crucial one, in that we need to consider not just what is the tone, what is the mood music around new legislation, but what does it mean in practice for real people. And clearly, you know, there is a sense in the country that we need to get the balance right around this. I've personally seen it as a positive that things like funding for the National Transfer Scheme for Refugee Children has been increased, that some of the caps, for example, around visas being issued have been removed. So the mood music, that some of the tone of the debate may have gone in one direction, some of the policy decisions may have gone in another. And it's really important, clearly, that we do get that balance right as this makes its way through Parliament. But we've had quite a few questions have cropped up. Some of them are quite specific ones, and some of them are more general ones for the whole of the panel. So what I'm going to do, if I may, is perhaps just start with the one particularly that is directed to Sarah. And sorry, I'm just scrolling through, find the question again. So, question for Sarah. Sorry, okay, let's start with the question for Dan, as I've got to that one first, which is, would you be able to share a bit more about the government's plans in respect of family reunion, which I know has been a subject of a lot of debate. So, Dan, would you be able to just perhaps pick up that one? And
yeah. So obviously, I can't say anything about what the government response will be in relation to the Immigration Social Security Act, because that's a matter for ministers to publish. as you know, currently refugees, people who are granted refugee status in this country have a right to family reunion of their spouse, and then there's extended exceptional routes for refugees and settled persons. Under the legislation before Parliament, for those who fall for temporary protection status, i.e. they have not claimed at their earliest opportunity, so in line with Article 31 of the Refugee Convention, or not shown good cause for their illegal entry or their unlawful status in the UK, if they can't be returned to their country of origin, they would be granted temporary protection status. The proposition in the bill, and that will be set out separately, alludes to the fact that their rights may be different in terms of family reunion. Obviously, though, that would also, we're governed by ECHR and Article 8, so any rules in that regard would be what is required to meet our Article 8 obligations. Oh, I can't hear you, David.
Thank you very much, Dan. And perhaps, given we've got a couple of representatives here from government, but also Sarah with the international perspective, there are a number of questions around the issue of safe and legal routes, and in particular, how in practical terms people would access those safe and legal routes if, for example, they're in a war zone or they're in a country where they are subject to an oppressive or dangerous regime. Now, certainly there's been some debate in Westminster about having a digital route open as one means of addressing some of those concerns. So there wouldn't, for example, be a requirement to make your way to a consulate or an embassy or something like that to lodge a claim, that you would be able to make it online. But clearly that also brings with it risks because it creates a digital trail, which said oppressive regime could then potentially crack down on. But perhaps, I'm looking perhaps at Dan, whether you'd like to say about that in the UK context, and then Sarah, I'd be really interested in your view about how other countries have addressed that particular challenge.
So I think there's a couple of things there. Obviously, there are the resettlement schemes working with UNHCR and other actors to provide safe and legal passage for those in genuine need of protection, and the government is very much in favour of those. The plan also alludes to amending the powers for the Home Secretary for people who are in urgent situations, where she can provide discretion for them to come to the UK. And also under our global resettlement scheme, we've looked at the possibility of having an emergency resettlement mechanism for, again, people who are in urgent need of quick resettlement, because we're conscious that, and we know that the process of resettlement can take time. I think the second thing to talk about is about the showing good cause for your illegal entry, and much of the clandestine arrival into the UK is from safe European countries. It is not from people who are, immediately flowing across the border from where they face persecution. And as I say, the Refugee Convention does talk about the urgency of flight and showing good cause. And I think, again, a lot of the focus here is what we see through illegal migration, both through the EU and onto the UK. Those people are not coming from that immediate danger, and therefore the good cause for not having claimed earlier in a safe country, and the people smuggling and organised crime that is underpinning that movement of people is the important element that the government is trying to tackle with this approach. So I think there is a distinction there, as I say, with the good cause, and the fact that what we're talking about is people coming across from the northern shores of Europe, either in lorries or small boats, rather than people immediately fleeing persecution across the border from the UK.
Thanks very much, Dan. That's very clear how the thinking is going there. Sarah, would you be able to share with us how other countries may have addressed this particular problem?
Yeah, I think the question about how someone would be removed from a country of origin where they are facing risk is extremely complicated and rare. This is precisely the situation that creates refugee movements, and why many refugees have to rely on smugglers to traverse conflict zones or to leave a country in order to reach safety. And it's almost an inevitable fact of the nature of conflicts today, and the fact that many won't be able to get a passport or a visa to do that. In terms of relatives who are in these situations hoping to join a refugee in the UK or somewhere else for the matter, and it's too risky for it to lodge an application in an embassy in the neighbouring country, or let alone from within their own country. We need to find ways around that. We need to waive in-person requirements and find remote ways of supporting it. It's not an easy question. UNHCR doesn't traditionally securely move people from one place to another to enable that to happen. In some countries where you have encampment policies, sometimes consular officials can move themselves and move to those areas and do the paperwork that's required. So there are some ideas there, and it's something we're very, very willing to work with the UK government to try to get around, as we saw some real barriers to this during COVID as well. And it's a really important, fundamental right that refugees have, and we need to make sure that we do everything we can to bring families together. I don't know if that answered it, but.
That's really helpful, Sarah. Can I just ask, perhaps press you a little bit on the point about other countries? So I'm not aware of any that, for example, have a facility to make a digital application from the country where someone is at risk seeking a visa or whatever the necessary permission is to flee to the UK, or also, are you aware of anybody who's got a digital route or has a practical alternative that is operational at the moment that we could scrutinise really and consider how we might apply here?
Yeah, it's a very good question that I'd have to take away, David. It's not within my specific remit in the organisation, but there may be examples that we can look to, and certainly through the UN Network on Migration, this is precisely the thing that the working group on safe and regular routes would probably be meeting to discuss, and that we can start looking to the GCM for guidance on as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Just again, looking at the questions that are very much coming through now, thick and fast. Quite a few quite detailed questions about the implications of the new legislation, and also someone's about essentially, I was criticising the point. Just on the issue about climate, so a few people have asked questions about that. What would the UK's view be about those who may be seeking refuge because they're affected by extreme climate conditions? Perhaps I think Paul and Jonathan, I know you both mentioned that in your remarks. Can I put that question to you? Do you have a view about how both the UK and the world more generally will need to respond specifically to the risks where people's seeking for asylum is for different reasons from those which may have been traditional?
I defer to Paul. I don't know.
So I'm just looking for Paul. He was here a moment ago.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, my video has been freezing, so apologies. At the moment, I think the best thing I can say on this is that we have just completed a rapid evidence assessment to look at the evidence on how climate and migration are linked. And we're about to publish that. We'll be holding a public event later imminently, actually. And so I'd invite people to join that. We can certainly disseminate that. We recognise that climate can exacerbate the drivers of migration. And as such, it's an important issue to look at in the context of COP. But I think this is an area where the evidence needs to be better understood, and we look to the international community and the UN system, as always, our friends in the UN, to help us understand these issues better. But as I say, I'll point you in the direction of our rapid evidence assessment, which will give you chapter and verse on where we're at. That's yet to be finalised, but as soon as it is, we'll share it. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. I could put to you and Dan just a question which is arising not just specifically around this point, but there seems to be a challenge from a number of the organisations in the sector about the degree of confidence in the ability of the Home Office to administer some of these processes. So people raising questions about, is evidence going to be secure? Is it going to be not lost? If, for example, there's a requirement for full disclosure at the first point of application, how can you be confident that everything that's being disclosed will be properly used in the system? And I know it is something that most of us as constituency members of Parliament will hear a bit about from time to time from constituents, whether with justification or not. But it'd be really useful to hear from you a little bit about, you know, how the Home Office is looking at investing in that to make sure that that is a process that works really well.
Thanks, David. It's probably for me to turn to it, and I alluded to this in my speech. So the primary legislation before Parliament is just one part of an overall programme of work. My colleagues in the operations, in the asylum and protection operations, there is a transformation programme underway there under their Director General around looking at the speed and efficiency, and I think Sarah alluded to some of that in terms of the work that we've been doing with UNHCR around that. There is obviously an implementation programme sitting alongside that, should the measures get royal assent to prepare the operation to do work on that. There's, you know, new IT systems, new workflow processes that are being put in place to ready for that approach. So, and again, some of the things that Paul was alluding to, I think, in his were for when people make subsequent claims after having had under the priority removal notice. So there is an enhanced non-means tested legal aid. Obviously, all asylum seekers are entitled to legal aid, but the priority removal notice under the bill also provides for further legal aid that's non-mean tested for all immigration basis for which someone may stay. So that's an upgrading, if you like, of the legal advice offer available. The element about the credibility of individuals is then when new or different evidence, or as occasionally we see in some cases, people change the basis of their claim or their nationality. It's at that stage, having had that process, that when people amend their rationale, that there is a steer to have minimal credibility unless there are exceptional circumstances. And I think, as Paul alluded to, we are conscious, and those were things that we discussed with partners as part of the consultation in terms of the way that trauma plays out, how the system can be geared to support people, particularly women potentially, or members of the LGBTQI+ community, and about how they deal with trauma and the history of that. So there is the exceptionality clauses within the bill that, and again, this will come down to implementation. So you're right to raise that the kind of critical factor will be how it is implemented, and it will be something we'll need to monitor and evaluate.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Sorry, I just wanted to come in on the climate point, if I may, David.
Yes, of course.
This is, sorry, that's my dog, who clearly needs to go for a walk. I apologise. The Global Compact on migration, it has quite progressive language on climate. Again, this was negotiated by the member states. It recognises that this is an issue that needs to be both addressed at source and also that accommodations need to be made for individuals and communities who are compelled to move as a result of climatic change, natural disasters, so on and so forth. I think it is extremely important. One message I would like to really impress upon you all today is that the issue of migration and movement, whether it's under a refugee regime, stricto sensu, or under the migration more broadly, is factored in to other discourses that we have. So, for example, as I mentioned, in our response to COVID-19 pandemic, and also as we address climate change. The COP26 is a pivotal moment. For some states, this is an existential issue. For many communities, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. We cannot wish this away. So we need to develop effective and sustainable mechanisms, and the only approach I would suggest is through cooperative mechanisms. So I'd really like us to figure out ways not simply to have discussions on migration, as welcome as this is, and truly this is welcome, but to make sure that this discourse filters into other policy discourse. I'll go on mute.
Thank you, Jonathan. Normally at these events, my cat appears on the screen and someone's dog starts barking at him, so it can be an interesting challenge working online. So there have been a couple of questions which perhaps Jonathan and Sarah, you might address, and that's around the compatibility of the proposed two-tier system with the Refugee Convention. Now, I dare say the Home Office will not have brought it forward unless they've taken advice and are of the view that it is compatible. But it would be interesting, given your international perspective on it, to hear your views on that particular point. So perhaps Sarah, maybe first, and then Jonathan.
Yeah, no, the two-tier system does exactly as it proposes, and it will create two types of refugees. One who, well, this is what we understand at least from the bill, and we're still digesting it. One that will have access to longer term leave and rights, and another that will have abridged rights, including to family reunion and to public welfare. Any refugee claim that's determined on UK territory and who's determined favourably to be a refugee must benefit from the full array of rights under the Refugee Convention. So in this respect, we are extremely concerned with this delineation. Article 31.1, which Dan Hobbs referred to, is an article which would typically prevent penalties for persons that arrive irregularly to the UK. It doesn't necessarily prevent those penalties, and Dan's right, if they don't arrive directly from the country of origin of which they are fleeing or present themselves early, but directly has been interpreted quite generously with an understanding of what people go through when they're on the move and the routes that they're required to take, and some of the deficiencies in protection they receive, including in Europe. So this needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, and no penalty should prevent someone from accessing asylum, nor should it be an excessive criminal sentence, for example, for steering a boat or an irregular entry. So we are deeply concerned by these provisions in the bill, but we've also provided an early observation on this, which I mentioned is on our website if you want to see our reflections in writing.
Thank you. Jonathan, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think this was largely an HCR directed question, but what I will say as a representative of the UN, and I must say at the outset that I have not read the bill. I've read some commentary on it, I've discussed with people, but I've not read the bill itself. I think a number of points. What human rights are not contingent, or they're only contingent in a set of very narrowly circumscribed situations. And I think one of the great achievements of the post-war world order was the creation, actually, which the UK was a central player of developing a very effective mechanism of international legal obligations. And I think it's important for the well-being of individuals and this rules-based order that this is upheld. If the UK government believes that is the case, if it believes that the human rights of individuals and the due process by which they can realise their human rights will be upheld through this legislation, then I don't see any problem. And I think this is where parliaments, as I said in my opening comments, along with other stakeholders, have a very important and legitimate scrutinising role to play to ensure that rigour is upheld. The other point, and my final point, if I may, is that it is important, if not more important, to treat the underlying causes than the symptoms. What is it that compels people to move in certain situations? I just made an intervention on climate, but I think that would apply to a broader range of situations that individuals face. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Now, time is against us, so we've got two more questions and contributors that are going to come in. I can't see you on screen, but Tim Farron, you're there somewhere.
Hi, David, I am, yes.
Ah, hello.
Hi, yeah, well, thanks for this. Well, first of all, but very, very quick, actually. I want to just focus on, I think this is a question for the Home Office, really, about what assessment has been made of the possibility for looking at what is often referred to as right to work for asylum seekers. I think that the case for people who are in the asylum seekers in the asylum system to be permitted to work, and I don't just mean, you know, working as brain surgeons and very, very specialist things, but, you know, generally being available for work is strong. I think there's a strong case in terms of the taxpayer, people being able to contribute to their own support. Obviously, it helps in terms of preventing destitution and poverty, so people can provide themselves and families. And actually, given that the very significant majority of cases do end up being proved, it's surely a really good thing in terms of integration. And so I know this has been talked about in the past. There's been some positive engagement from the government and the Home Office in the past, but I wondered if this was something that might be considered during this legislation.
Thank you. Dan, you're poised to answer that question.
Yeah, so obviously it is a matter for ministers. I think there is a challenge with it in that it conflates economic routes and asylum then, because actually if there is a way to access the labour market, which is regulated by the Future Border and Immigration System, the global points-based system, there is something about the transparency and clarity about how people should migrate. So I think there is a challenge in the issue of asylum seeker right to work, because it actually undermines the global rules-based route to work. As you alluded to, the previous Home Secretary committed to a review. Ministers are considering both the findings of the reports that we've seen externally and other analysis, and I anticipate that they will make a decision on that point. It's not, I can't comment right now, but as I say, I think some of the challenges it's around half the people as well that get granted. I mean, the grant rate fluctuates, but there is still a challenge that if you go into the asylum system, there is still somewhere between 40 to 50% of people that get refused if there's a work right at that point. It does undermine the wider economic migration system.
Just a quick come back very quickly, David, on that. I mean, so I think obviously the phrase right to work might seem loaded, so you can call it something else, but there are clearly already exemptions based upon the length of time somebody waiting and on specific professions. So if that's permissible, then it's permissible more widely, and the financial benefits to the country and the integration benefits, as well as the basic compassion for people involved, seem very, very, very large. Like you say, I'm sure it's a matter for ministers, but should we say there's a right wing and a left wing argument for it, and they're both very strong, and it seems odd that it's missing.
Just one come back. I think the economic arguments aren't necessarily as clear as some of the research. I mean, if you look at employment rates of actual refugees, there is I mean, it's partly the reason why we're looking at the Refugee Outcome Fund. Actually, employment rates of those who are genuine refugees out of the system is particularly low. So some of the assumptions around the likely wage level that people would gain and the stability of that employment, I think, are things that need to be considered as part of that. But as you say, it's an issue for ministers. But
look, thanks, Danny. You answered the questions very patiently. I appreciate you are on a call with a number of members of both houses of Parliament, so therefore it's always a challenge. Colbasia, I think you're there somewhere. You had what is hopefully going to be a very, very quick point, I'm afraid, as we move to wrapping up.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I think the first point that I want to make, I disagree with Dan framing of the issue. I think the issue is not that people want to pay smuggler, but the issue is that it's so much difficult for people to get access. That's why they find a different way to get access, to get to the safety. And also, I think because I think the time is limited. So we are a network of people lived experience of the asylum and also the immigration system. And this Friday we're running a rally with lived experience and putting our experiences out there, and also coming with a recommendation in relationship with this with this bill. So I'm inviting you all, because we have few elements that constitute what we call it like a fair, not a fair, but a welcoming Britain from lived experience perspective. So this Friday 1 o'clock I put I put a link in the chat, and David, I send you an invitation as well. I hope that you can make it as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Claude. That's a very good note to finish on, because it reminds us all that there are real people at the heart of this system, and that we always need to be mindful of that. It is about ensuring that we have laws that are fit for purposes and processes that are fit for purpose, but also recognising that the UK, as has been said by a number of the speakers, is playing a leading role as a humanitarian nation, both in resettlement and in global work. And we need to ensure that we are able to play our part in that. I'd like to just wrap up by saying, firstly, a big thank you to our panel of experts. I was particularly appreciative, may feel sometimes for our colleagues from the Home Office, like coming into the lion's den, but I'm very grateful both for your presence and also the very comprehensive answers and contributions that you were able to give. It was enormously useful. And I'm sure for all the parliamentarians on the call, it will inform our thinking as we go into the debate about this issue in the next few weeks. I'd like also to thank the International Organisation for Migration and RAMP, as well as the APPG, for helping to organise today's event, and all the parliamentarians themselves for dialing in order to ensure that when the debate happens, it is as well informed as it possibly can be. So thank you, everybody, for your attendance and contributions, and that brings this afternoon's session to a close.